exclusive conflicts but interlinked, and therefore it is important that we coordinate. Just as we have seen there has been coordination at the United Nations, he will be aware of the very real concern that the UN sanctions regime on both Iran and Russia is being undermined. Now, the UN has combined together to support a ceasefire and to call for that. What more is he doing to make sure that the UN works for sanctions on both Russia and Iran? Does he recognise that waiting until June for the G7 to act may be too long in a situation where every single day counts to stop further military action?
Madam Deputy Speaker, what I was talking about with the G7 was regard to Russian assets, where obviously the G7 has an outsized economic role that it can play. So it's important that there is G7 coordination first and foremost. When it comes to sanctions evasion, last year we funded the economic deterrence regime that we have specifically to target sanctions evasion. She's right that it's a growing issue and one that I can reassure her we are tackling together with our allies.
James Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Notwithstanding the drones and the missiles which were launched by Iran and quite rightly taken out by UK planes and our allies, they prefer to operate in the shadows through proxies and through an increasingly sophisticated cyber operation. So would the Prime Minister agree with me that our priority should be working with international allies to go after where Iran is promoting illicit finance and weapons smuggling, as well as working with our international partners to combat their cyber operations?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. I can reassure him we are working closely with international partners, not least on cyber, but also on weapons smuggling. As I said, I'm pleased that the Royal Navy is playing a significant role in combating that with interdictions of illegal arms shipments, both last year and the year before, and contributing as we speak to Operation Prosperity Guardian.
Andy MacDonald.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I just point out to the Prime Minister that a nation-state having the capacity to observe international humanitarian law is quite different to actually doing so. But at this terrifying moment for the world, I think we're all mightily relieved that Iran, which must be condemned for what it did, failed in inflicting serious loss of life on people in the region. And the de-escalation call is correct, as is the commitment not to engage in offensive action. But it was explicit in his statement that all people are entitled to security and peace. But sadly for the people of Gaza, the calls for restraint have not worked. So what additional options is he considering? Because surely an immediate ceasefire, the funding of UNRWA, is the best way to secure security for the region and also the release of all the hostages.
Prime Minister.
Well, it's important that the hostages are released, and that's what we continue to call for. And as the honourable gentleman knows, it was Hamas yet again this weekend that rejected the latest round of negotiations to get those hostages back to safety.
I am anxious to be able to get everybody in, so I would plead for a brevity in the questions, please. Thank you. Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I place on the record my condolences to the Speaker and his family? Could I commend the Prime Minister for his statement and the leadership he has shown? But given this despicable attack on the civilian population of Israel by Iran, does he agree with me that the world cannot risk a nuclear-armed Iran? And will he commit to the House today that he will support whatever it takes, including not taking military action off the table, to ensure that this nightmare never happens?
Well, as I said, there's no credible civilian justification for the enrichment levels that we've seen the IAEA has reported are happening in Iran. We're committed to using all diplomatic tools to ensure that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon, including using the snapback mechanism if necessary.
Neil Hanley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I oppose all acts of violence, and I welcome the Prime Minister's calls for de-escalation and restraint. But I can't be the only person who wonders where those calls for de-escalation and restraint were 6 months ago. And given those calls, does he share my concerns that the political fortunes of Prime Minister Netanyahu, in whose hands such a choice rests, are so heavily invested in the continuation of conflict?
We've continued to call on the Israeli government to do everything it can to protect civilian life as it exercises its indeed right and duty to ensure security for its citizens, and I'll continue to raise those points with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Bob Blackman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, effectively over the weekend, Iran declared war on our friend and ally Israel. And clearly, when the Prime Minister talks to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's going to have to be very careful about how he persuades him to exercise self-restraint. So clearly a menu of options has to be what the British government and what the British people are going to do in assisting Israel in resisting Iran. So the proscription of the IRGC, the removal of the embassy here and return of all those officials to Iran, our officials returning to the United Kingdom, and the harshest possible sanctions against the regime in Iran are the fundamentals that are required.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have already sanctioned over 400 different Iranian individuals and entities, including the IRGC in its entirety, and we continue to discuss with international partners how best we can coordinate future actions.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Everyone in this House is united in wanting to see the fighting in Gaza come to an end as soon as possible, with a sustainable ceasefire in place. As the Prime Minister quite rightly states, it was once again Hamas who had rejected a US broker deal which would see the fighting stop, hostages released, and allow far more aid to get into Gaza. So what pressure is the government applying to our allies in the region who provide support to Hamas to urge them to do all they can to make Hamas accept a deal?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her question and agree with her. We're doing everything we can, talking to allies in the region to put pressure on Hamas to accept a deal and get the hostages released. That is the best and most important way we can move towards a sustainable ceasefire that we all want to see.
Steve Double.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and the clear leadership he's providing on this very important matter. As a beacon of liberal democracy in the region, Israel's security is our security. And it's quite clear from the weekend that serious loss of life was only avoided because of the effectiveness of Israeli defence mechanisms supported by the UK and others. Does the Prime Minister share my concern that those calling for an arms embargo against Israel are not only misguided, but they risk weakening Israel's ability to defend itself and encouraging those who wish Israel harm?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said, we stand by Israel's right to defend itself. It is important that they continue to abide by international humanitarian law. That will always be important to us, and we continually keep all arms exports under review, and we have one of the strictest regimes anywhere in the world.
Madam Kaiser.
Deputy Speaker, the events of the weekend mark a dangerous new chapter in the long history of conflict in the Middle East. Does the Prime Minister accept that proportionality is key and must include the conduct of all parties, including the 192 days of uninterrupted and constant bombardment of Gaza in response to what was, of course, a horrific attack by Hamas? It has now killed over 32,000 civilians in Gaza, a place where children look to the sky, not knowing if aid or bombs are going to fall on them. Is that proportionate, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we continue to support Israel's right to defend itself and ensure security for its citizens. It must do that in accordance with international humanitarian law, and we'll continue to make that point to the Israelis.
Greg Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I join with others in thanking the Prime Minister for his leadership in ensuring that the United Kingdom government stands shoulder to shoulder with our allies Israel in the face of yet another attack. But will you agree with me that the first and most pressing mission for Israel so that they can live in safety and security continues to be the necessity to defeat Hamas, and that will, the harsh reality is that will require an operation in Rafah, whilst every step must be taken to protect civilian life? Will my right honourable friend agree with me that that is the path to peace in the Middle East?
My honourable friend is right to highlight the threat that Hamas poses to the security and safety of the people of Israel. The Foreign Secretary set out in detail our view on the right approach to Rafah from this point forward just a couple of weeks ago.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister rightly calls for restraint and de-escalation in the Middle East. Isn't there more chance that his words will carry weight if they advocate a ceasefire by all sides, including the warring parties in Gaza?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have called for an immediate humanitarian pause in Gaza so that hostages can be released, aid can go in, and for that to form the basis of a more lasting and sustainable ceasefire.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for his strong international leadership in this area and for his calls for restraint. The Prime Minister will agree that Iran is the dangerous and destabilising player in this region, whether by themselves directly or through their proxies. It's also a despotic medieval regime. There were 853 executions last year, an 8-year high, including 22 women and young women. So as the Prime Minister works urgently with the G7, please would he confirm that no reasonable option should be off the table, including the possible prescription of the IRGC? Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Iran's human rights record remains completely unacceptable. We've sanctioned almost 100 entities and individuals specifically for human rights violations. For example, we condemn its surging use of the death penalty, and at the 78th UN General Assembly, we co-sponsored the Iran Human Rights Resolution calling for Iran to issue a moratorium on executions.
Once again, can I say I am anxious to get everybody in, but I can only do that if the questions are brief. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 33,000 people have died in Gaza. More bombs have been dropped there than were dropped in the whole of the Iraq War. This weekend's horrific events show just how dangerous it is that there's going to be an escalation into war across the whole region. Does the Prime Minister recognise that the central kernel to the whole issue across the region is the continued Israeli occupation of Palestine? What will he say about bringing about an end to that occupation and a permanent ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, of course we want to see and remain committed to a two-state solution and working hard to bring that about. But the biggest impact on regional instability is the pernicious influence of Iran and nobody else.
Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that even those that want to link the conflict between Israel and Hamas and their conduct with this attack have to surely recognise that since its inception, for decades, Iran has sought the destruction not only of our way of life, but of Israel and its people, and that we should never hesitate to play our part in preventing that?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I agree with him wholeheartedly.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. I also echo the calls for restraint and de-escalation. I was interested in what the Prime Minister said about the diplomatic efforts over the last 6 months with the Palestinian Authority looking towards a two-state solution. Given the issues are settlements, water, access between Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem, what window of opportunity does he think there is with the Netanyahu government to get all parties round the table?
Prime Minister.
Well, it's something we've continually pushed for, and in the meantime, what we've also focused on is building up the technical administrative capability of the Palestinian Authority so they are in a position to provide effective and strong governance for West Bank and Gaza when the moment arrives when that is possible, something we work very hard to bring about.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the United Nations Secretary said the Middle East is on the brink. The people of the region are confronting a real danger of devastating, full-scale conflict, and now is the time to defuse and de-escalate. Does the Prime Minister agree with the United Nations Secretary? And if so, what is the Government Secretary to achieve this as he works with our international allies?
Prime Minister.
Well, of course, we do want to avoid further escalation and bloodshed, which would be deeply destabilising for the region and risk more lives, and that's a message that all government ministers will be taking to their counterparts across the region.
Harry Gardner.
Iran sought to justify its unjustifiable attack on Israel on the basis that it was retaliating for Israel's attack on its consulate. I welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has said that in his telephone conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu later today, he will be urging de-escalation. In that telephone conversation, will he set out the measures that the UK will take if, in fact, Israel seeks to retaliate further?
Prime Minister.
So I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals, but we will, of course, calm heads to prevail everywhere across the region.
Beth Winter.
Diolch yn fawr, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the Security Council last night, the UN General Secretary did warn of the danger of devastating full-scale conflict and called for de-escalation and maximum restraint. And today, in response, the Foreign Secretary has said there could have been thousands of casualties and pressure for an escalation of this conflict. Does the Prime Minister agree with this? And does the Prime Minister also agree that the very real tens of thousands of deaths and casualties Israel's military attacks and imposed famine conditions have caused in Gaza are drivers of regional instability?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we want to avoid further escalation and bloodshed, which would be deeply destabilising for the region and risk more lives, which is why we're calling on all regional partners to focus on being calm and de-escalating the situation.
Alison Toulis.
My constituent Sama has been trying to get her mother, her father and her brother out of Gaza since this conflict began. They've been displaced multiple times. They are now in a tent in Rafah. They cannot apply. There is no scheme for them to come to safety in the UK. And the UK government has this in its hands. It could waive the need for biometrics if the government so decided to. Will the Prime Minister do this and let Sama's family come to safety?
Obviously, I'm not aware of the specifics of the Honourable Lady's case, but I'm sure if she writes to the Home Office, they'll be happy to look into it for her.
Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. 4 former UK Supreme Court judges and more than 600 lawyers, including over 60 cases, have warned the Prime Minister that the UK risks breaking international law over a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza if it does not stop its weapons export to Israel. But the Prime Minister is ignoring their warnings and hiding his own government's legal advice on this matter. Why, Prime Minister?
No, that's not right, Madam Deputy Speaker. So we have a very robust and rigorous export licensing regime. The Foreign Secretary confirmed last week that the UK's position on export licences is unchanged following the latest assessment and in line with the legal advice. We keep that position under review and always act in accordance with that advice.
Abby Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Middle East has entered a very dangerous new phase, which can only be resolved by diplomatic and political solutions. So can I push the Prime Minister on what he said earlier in terms of the sanctions that he is considering with international allies in relation to Iran, including the prescribing of the IRGC? And will he also confirm that the UK will not be taking part in any offensive action of Israel's?
Madam Deputy Speaker, no, we acted in a defensive capacity and we're discussing with G7 allies further diplomatic measures that can be taken in a coordinated fashion.
Stephen Farrell.
Thank you. Iran's attack on Israel and the nature of the Iranian regime. The Prime Minister says he wants to see stability in the region, but surely there must be honesty and transparency that Israel itself is a threat to stability and has already systematically broken international humanitarian law. The government has no reluctance in rightly challenging Russia over Ukraine in that regard, but why the reluctance in relation to Israel and indeed to publish the associated legal advice?
Minister.
I said I don't think there's any equivalence between what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine and what Israel is doing to ensure the security of its citizens in the face of an appalling terrorist attack.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's been over 15 months since it was reported that prescription of the IRGC was imminent. Since then, Iran has continued to fund and supply Hamas, Iran has continued to fund and supply Hezbollah, and Iran has continued to fund and supply the Houthis. Following this continued funding for terror and destabilisation, what more does Iran have to do before the IRGC is prescribed?
Prime Minister.
As I've said, the police, security services and courts all have the tools they need to sanction, prosecute and mitigate the threats from Iran. We've strengthened our Iran sanctions regime recently and the IRGC is sanctioned in its entirety.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister said in his statement that it was important that aid gets into Gaza, and then he said a few moments ago that the government was right to take its time to decide on the restoration of funding to UNRWA. Madam Deputy Speaker, the organisational infrastructure of UNRWA is unparalleled and it cannot be replicated. A further delay on the part of the UK government will cost
further lives in a context in which famine is taking hold? Can I urge the Prime Minister to think again and to set out a path today for the restoration of funding to UNRWA?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know the whole House will have rightly been appalled by the allegations that UNRWA staff were involved in October 7th. We want UNRWA to give detailed undertakings about changes in personnel policy and procedures to ensure that nothing like that could ever happen again. We're working actively with allies to try and bring about this situation to a rapid conclusion. I'll just say we're expecting final reports from the UN and others into what happened by the end of April this month, and then intend to clarify the UK's position on funding once we've reviewed those final reports.
O'Hara.
Speaker, Israel has indicated that against the advice of the international community, including the UN and the United States, that it intends to respond to Iran's attack. Such a retaliation could tip the region into a catastrophic all-out war. So when persuading Prime Minister Netanyahu against further retaliation, and in terms of leverage, will he say to Israel that should they choose to escalate, there will be no further UK military support for Israel's endeavours in this conflict?
I'm sure the honourable gentleman meant to also condemn Iran for what happened over the weekend, but we will continue to urge de-escalation and calm heads to prevail on all sides.
Tamarjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Iran is, of course, no ally of the UK, and its huge, unprecedented assault on Israel must be called out. But the UK government must now work hard to prevent further escalation of the crisis in an already volatile region. Now, it is a matter of principle that diplomatic premises are not targeted. So can the Prime Minister confirm what conversations he has had with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu about the attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria, and whether he plans to discuss that with him?
As I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue to urge de-escalation and calm heads to prevail on all sides. And as Foreign Secretary said this morning, we would urge Israel in particular to recognise that it successfully repelled the Iranian attacks and Iran is ever more isolated on the world stage.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you. Jackie, the mother of the murdered aid worker, James Kirby, is my constituent, and I'm sure she'll agree with the Prime Minister's description of him as a hero. But there's a real danger, which I'm already seeing as events move on, that his death will end up just being chalked up as collateral damage in this conflict. So can I ask the Prime Minister to really show that he understands that the family need to see justice done, and can he keep up the pressure on Israel about this review? They want to know why he was killed and that someone will be held responsible.
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, my condolences to Jackie and the families of all those that were tragically killed as they were delivering aid. As I said, they were heroes and they absolutely deserve our admiration, and our thoughts will be with all their families. I'll refer her to my previous answer about what we've asked of the Israelis, and what's crystal clear though is there needs to be a considerable improvement in the deconfliction mechanisms between Israel and aid agencies. That's crystal clear. I've made that point already to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we expect to see that followed through.
Christine Jardine.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I join my right honourable friend from Kingston and Surbiton in unequivocally condemning the action of the Iranian regime on Saturday and in supporting our RAF in their actions. But my constituents in Edinburgh West, like many others, are concerned that now attention will be taken away from the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. So can the Prime Minister assure us that when he speaks to the Prime Minister of Israel later today, he impresses upon him not only the need for restraint to restabilise the region, but that he has a unique opportunity now to take steps towards peace by making a gesture with promoting a ceasefire and allowing aid into Gaza?
Our position remains unchanged. We continue to want to see an immediate humanitarian pause, so hostages are released, aid goes in, and immediately we want Israel to deliver on its commitments to significantly increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza on the various measures that they've set out.
Toby Perkins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the question from the right honourable member from North Somerset exposed that there is much more that we could be doing to undermine the murderous Iranian regime. Simultaneously, the way that Israel continues to ignore the United Nations resolutions deeply troubling. Is the Prime Minister worried that his approach risks failing both on Iran and on Israel at the moment?
No. No, Madam Deputy Speaker. As we've demonstrated this weekend, the UK is leading with allies, defending our values and our interests, standing together with our friends to bring about regional security. That's good for people in the region, and it's good for people here at home too.
Dr. Rupert Huck. Iran's reckless actions only add more fuel on an already raging fire. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will he prescribe the IRG, and what assessment has he made of whether bombing a consulate violates international law? What are we doing to uphold this principle in a war that's gone on 6 months and cost so many lives?
Refer the Honourable Lady to any of my previous answers on both of those topics.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In response to my honourable friend, the Prime Minister said he would take the time to set future approach to UNRWA right. So as the famine continues, I wonder, Prime Minister, how much time he actually needs before he makes up his mind to restore funding and get aid to the people who need it.
Prime Minister.
What the Honourable Lady failed to mention was the shocking allegations of people being involved in UNRWA, being involved in the massacre on October 7th. It is right that that is properly investigated and new procedures are put in place to ensure that that could never happen again. Those final reports which have been commissioned are due at the end of April. Once we review those, and we're already in dialogue with our partners, we'll set out our future approach. But that's not to say we are not already doing an enormous amount to bring more aid into the region. We've tripled our commitment and right now are delivering aid by land, sea and air. We're taking a leading role, and everyone in this House should be incredibly proud of what the UK is bringing to the table.
Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The action of the Royal Air Force in shooting down Iranian drones and cruise missiles heading to and over Israel over the weekend raises a very serious question. Since the UK is clearly capable of acting to prevent airstrikes in both the region, and both the ICJ and the UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine and the occupied territories have implicated Israel in a genocide in Gaza, why isn't the government interested in fulfilling its obligations under international law by protecting Palestinian women and children from Israeli airstrikes? Why isn't the government acting to prevent the killing of Palestinians?
Well, I just disagree with the Honourable Lady. Whilst, of course, we respect the role and the independence of the ICJ, our view is that Israel's actions in Gaza can simply not be described as a genocide, and that case is not helpful at all in achieving our goal of a sustainable and lasting ceasefire.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The threat of imminent famine hangs over the people of Gaza. Aid urgently needs to get into the country and to be safely distributed. Will the Prime Minister confirm, with the death of those 3 UK charity workers working for World Central Kitchen, has he received a written apology from the Prime Minister of Israel?
I spoke explicitly to the Prime Minister of Israel, who did that when I spoke to him the very next day. We've made absolutely crystal clear our concerns about what's happened, and as I've previously pointed out, are looking now through the preliminary findings. Pleased to see the early dismissal of 2 or suspension of 2 officers involved, and now what we need is reform of Israel's deconfliction mechanism to ensure the future safety of aid workers.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In speaking to the Prime Minister of Israel this evening, in calling for restraint, will he put that into action? So should the Prime Minister say that he will further assaults in Gaza, or indeed impede aid, will he action that restraint and call for immediate ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
We've already called for an immediate humanitarian pause so more aid can get in and hostages can be released, and we ourselves, as I said, tripled our aid commitment and bringing aid in by air, land and sea together with our allies.
Alan Brown.
Madam Deputy Speaker, so there's been over 33,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, including 14,000 children, 76,000 civilians injured or maimed, 700 healthcare and aid workers killed. And given there's the ongoing famine, which the UK government under his watch is now trying to find ways around the Israeli blockade that's preventing aid getting in, isn't that in itself an admission that ongoing Israeli actions are disproportionate and shouldn't be calling it out as such?
Prime Minister.
We've been consistently clear that we are concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, have called on the Israelis to open up more aid corridors and have them open more often. They've set out a series of steps just recently, and now we want to see them deliver on those.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Middle East is in a crisis, and myself and thousands of my Riverside constituents have been calling for a ceasefire to end the destruction in Gaza and prevent the widening conflict in the Middle East. The Prime Minister has talked about diplomatic action towards a two-state solution. Can he say what action he's taken against the far-right ministers in the Israeli government who are opposed to a two-state solution?
Prime Minister.
Well, we've been very clear that our view is that we should have a two-state solution, and we're making sure we do everything we can to contribute to that aim.
Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the wider humanitarian crisis in Gaza, there is now a famine across the area, and in response to a number of questions from my honourable friend, the Prime Minister said that, I think he said, that he's now received the interim report on UNRWA and that in due course he'll receive the final report. Will he publish the interim report, and if not, why not? And with Canada, France, Finland, Australia, Sweden and the EU having now restored funding, why does the UK stand alone?
Minister.
When it comes to UNRWA, it's the UN that is publishing the expected final reports towards the end of April, and after receiving those, we will clarify and set out the UK's position on future funding.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Prime Minister very much for his decisive action, his support for Israel, and thank our world-class Royal Air Force for preventing the further loss of life. Just last week I had an opportunity to be in Israel, to visit the kibbutz where the people were murdered, innocent Jews, to go to the Nova musical festival where over 1,000 Israelis were murdered, and to speak to some of those families. So in relation to Hamas and their sponsorship, the IRGC, does the Prime Minister agree that Hamas and IRGC can be likened to cancer, and to save life throughout the Middle East and retain stability, that the cancer of Hamas and IRGC needs to be removed urgently by all means necessary?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is right to point out the destabilising impact of Iran across the region, including action through proxies like Hamas, the Houthis and others, and we'll do everything we can to counter that threat.
Richard Ford.
Thank you. Our constituents will always want us to think about second-order consequences of British military action. When the government deployed the RAF to defend civilians in Libya, a full parliamentary debate was held afterwards and a vote was granted to members of this House. This was in line with the convention that has been observed for most of the last 20 years. Will the government grant members a full debate and a vote on British military action even after the action has happened?
No, Madam Speaker, I don't believe that's necessary. I'm obviously here answering questions. It's my job to take action where I believe it is necessary, and it's this job of Parliament to hold me accountable for that. But it was right that we moved quickly to respond to an immediate and dangerous threat. Publicising any action in advance would undermine the effectiveness of the operation. We acted in line with precedent, and we've also made very clear in public statements that we will not hesitate to protect our allies.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and I suspect there'll be a slight change of personnel before we move to the statement from the Secretary of State for Health, Victoria Atkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I would like to make a statement on the CAS review of gender identity services for children and young people. And may I say how pleased I am to be joined by parents of children who have been affected by some of the issues raised in this review, and I hope all of us will bear the sensitivities of this debate in mind as we discuss it this afternoon. This review strikes hard and strikes sure at an area of public policy where fashionable cultural values have overtaken evidence, safety and biological reality. This must now stop. As recently as 2009, the NHS's sole gender identity development service at the Tavistock and Portman Trust received fewer than 60 referrals for children and young people, and just 15 for adolescent girls. Since then, demand has surged. By 2016, over 1,700 children and young people a year were referred, a 34-fold increase. More than half were teenage girls. In 2022, more than 5,000 children and young people were referred to gender identity clinics, and almost 3/4 were female. Madam Deputy Speaker, this exponential increase in demand is not a coincidence. It has been driven by a number of factors, which I will come on to later, but at its heart, it was driven by a myth. This myth was that for children and young people grappling with adolescence, who were questioning their identity, their sexuality, or their path in life, that the answer to their questions was inevitably to change gender, to solve their feelings of unease, discomfort, or distress. And this near uniform prescription was imposed on children and young people with complex needs, without full and thoughtful consideration of their wider needs, including, as is set out in the report, conditions such as neurodiversity, experiences such as childhood trauma, or experiences of mental health conditions, or indeed discovering who it is that they may one day fall in love with. Indeed, the response from some of the people who should have protected them, some of the clinicians in charge of their care at the Tavistock Clinic, was almost always to put them on an irreversible path, blocking puberty, then the prescription of cross-sex hormones, and onto surgery as an adult. In other words, such professionals were not asking the right questions of themselves or of their patients. That is why in 2020, with the support of my predecessors, my right honourable friends, the members for West Suffolk and for Bromsgrove, NHS England commissioned Dr Hilary Cass to examine the state of services for children questioning their gender. And I would like to start by thanking Dr Cass and her team for undertaking a considered, comprehensive and courageous review into an extremely contentious area of healthcare. Since NHS England commissioned the review in 2020, they have unpicked meticulously what went wrong, what the evidence actually shows, and they have recommended how to design a fundamentally different service that better serves the needs of children. But I must also thank those who raised the alarm and contributed to the review over the last 4 years. The clinicians who spoke up against their peers to blow the whistle about what was happening at the Tavistock Clinic, even though it risked their careers. The journalists, academics and activists who listened to their stories and investigated further, even when they were derided as bigots and transphobes. The parents who were just trying their best to support their children, but were so badly let down by a service that vilified them for questioning whether the interventions offered were the right ones for their children. And of course, the young people themselves who have shared their experiences, including those who have gone through the pain of detransitioning, only to find out that the so-called reversible treatments they were offered are not, in fact, reversible. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Cass review makes for sober reading. It is extremely thorough, and so I will not attempt to cover all of its recommendations today, but I genuinely encourage all honourable and right honourable members to read the report in full. It should concern every single member of this House that part of our public space, the NHS, was overtaken by a culture of secrecy and ideology that was allowed to trump evidence and safety. We say enough is enough. Our young people deserve better, and we must do whatever it takes to protect them. Since the publication of Dr. Cass's interim report in 2022, a series of important changes have been made, and I want to put on record my thanks to NHS England's Chief Executive, Amanda Pritchard, and all of those at NHS England who have worked hard with Dr. Cass to implement these. On the 31st of March, the Tavistock Clinic finally closed, having stopped seeing new patients a year earlier. 2 new regional hubs have been opened in partnership with the country's most prestigious children's hospitals to ensure that children are supported by specialist multidisciplinary teams, and indeed another will follow in Bristol later this year. In the last few weeks, NHS England made the landmark decision to end the routine prescription to children of puberty blockers for gender dysphoria. On the day of publication of Dr. Cass's final report, they announced that they are stopping children under 18 from being seen by adult gender services with immediate effect. And an urgent review on clinical policy for cross-sex hormones will now follow without delay. I also welcome NHS England's plans to bring forward their full review of adult services, including Dr. Cass's recommendation for a follow-through service for young people up to the age of 25. I also share Dr. Cass's concerns that clinicians who subscribe to gender ideology will try to use private providers to get around the rules. Let me give a very clear warning. Prescribing is a highly regulated activity, and the Care Quality Commission has not licensed any gender clinic to prescribe hormone blockers or cross-sex hormones to people under the age of 16. Any clinic that does may be committing extremely serious regulatory offences for which they can have their licence revoked and their clinicians can be struck off. My officials have been in contact with the CQC following the final report to ask that they look again at the age thresholds in their licensing conditions. The CQC has also reassured us that they will incorporate Dr. Cass's recommendations into their safe care and treatment standards for all care providers. This means that all new providers will be asked if their practices respect the Cass review, and all existing providers have to meet the same rigorous standards when they are reviewed by the CQC. My officials met the General Medical Council over the weekend and will do so again in the coming days to understand how they will ensure every clinician on their register follows their code of practice and implements the wider findings of the Cass review. It is morally and medically reprehensible that some online providers not registered in the UK have stated their intention to continue to issue prescriptions to children in this country, and I am looking closely at closing what can be done to curtail any loopholes in prescribing practices, including legislative options. Nothing is off the table, and I will update the House in due course as we progress this work at pace. Dr. Cass also found that there was a lack of robust data on what happened to the 9,000 children who were treated by gender identity services between 2009 and 2020. Many went on to continue their treatment at adult clinics, and the University of York had been due to research the long-term consequences of treatment they received as children so that we can properly support them through their journey into adulthood. It was expected to provide important insights into the clinic's work, including how many patients detransitioned, how many were also diagnosed with a mental health condition or an autism spectrum disorder. We took, this government, the unprecedented step of changing the law to make it possible for adult gender clinics to share medical data with the university. All bar one of the adult gender clinics refused to cooperate with this vital research. This is unacceptable, to quote Dr. Cass. I'd go even further. I think it is deplorable. It is a dereliction of their professional duty. And so I am pleased to update the House that following the publication of Dr. Cass's report, I have been informed that all 7 clinical leads for the adult gender services now intend to fully participate in this important work. Dr. Cass also concludes that a cultural shift alone does not adequately explain the huge growth in young women being referred to gender services. She paints an alarming picture of digitally engaged young women who are frequently exposed to pornography, involving violent, coercive, degrading and pain-inducing acts. Is it any wonder that more and more of them are looking for ways to opt out of becoming women? This is deeply troubling, and as Dr. Cass makes clear, we have a duty to support these young women with considered evidence-based care. Madam Deputy Speaker, our children deserve healthcare that is compassionate, caring and careful. Their safety and well-being must come above any other concern, and anyone who threatens it must be held to account. I will work with NHS England to root out the ideology that has caused so much unnecessary harm, to support those who have already received life-altering treatment, to give the next generation access to holistic care, and to protect our children's futures. Anything less would be neglecting our duty to the next generation. This will not happen under this government, and it will not happen under my watch. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State, West Street.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by thanking the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement, and even more importantly, thanking Dr. Hilary Cass and her team for the thoughtful and thorough way in which they've undertaken their work. She has navigated the complexities and sensitivities of this subject with academic rigour, providing an evidence-led framework for children to receive the best possible healthcare. I also want to pay tribute to journalists like Hannah Barnes and the whistleblowers who together helped shine a light on what was going on at the Tavistock Clinic. At the heart of the complexity around this issue are two things which are true simultaneously. There are trans adults in this country who have followed a medical pathway and who say that for all the pain and difficulty that involved, it wasn't just life-affirming, it was life-saving. There are also people in this country who followed a medical pathway who say it was a disaster, that it ruined their lives irreversibly, and they ask how anyone could have let this happen. For the sake of all of those children, young people and now adults, but particularly those being referred into gender identity services today, we have a duty to get this right. What has emerged in the Cass review is a scandal. It is a scandal that children and young people are waiting far too long, often years, for care, while their well-being deteriorates and their childhood slips away. It is scandalous that medical interventions have been made on the basis of shaky evidence. It is scandalous that despite all this, some NHS providers refused to cooperate with Dr. Cass's review. And perhaps the worst scandal of all is that the toxicity of this discussion means that people have felt silenced, and it required investigative journalism to prompt this review taking place. This particularly vulnerable group of children and young people are at the wrong end of all of the statistics for mental ill health, suicide and self-harm. There is no doubt that they have been very badly let down. So we owe it to them to approach this discussion with the same care and sensitivity with which Dr. Cass undertook her review. There are parts of this report which will sound familiar to anyone acquainted with the NHS today. Children and young people face unacceptably long waiting lists. They are unable to get the mental health support and assessments they require. The services face significant staff shortages, with a lack of workforce planning driving all of it. As with so many parts of the NHS today, this report paints a picture of a service unable to cope with demand. Dr. Cass is clear that care must be personal and holistic. So can the Secretary of State set out how she plans to cut waiting times for assessments for mental health and neurodevelopmental conditions? Waiting lists are so bad in some cases that children are passing into adulthood before they have had their first appointment with gender identity services, leaving them facing a cliff edge. Cass recommends follow-through services up to the age of 25 to ensure continuity of care. Can the Secretary of State provide an indication of how long she thinks it will take to establish these services? Madam Deputy Speaker, Labour welcomed the decision taken by NHS England last month to stop the routine prescription of puberty blockers to under 18s. The loophole that now exists for private providers risks sparking a black market. The Secretary of State has said she expects private clinics to follow the recommendations in this report, indeed to follow the evidence. Can I underline our support for her expectations on compliance? And can she give an indication as to whether she thinks further regulation may be needed to ensure adequate enforcement of the recommendations? Madam Deputy Speaker, the refusal of adult gender services to share data of the long-term experience of patients is inexcusable, as the Secretary of State said, and I agree. It is deplorable. The data does not belong to them. It belongs to the NHS and, crucially, to patients. Of course, I welcome that they are now coming forward, but I also ask the Secretary of State how this was allowed to happen and what accountability she thinks would be appropriate. Madam Deputy Speaker, this report must provide a watershed moment for the NHS's gender identity services. Children's healthcare should always be led by evidence and in the best interests of children's welfare. Dr. Cass's report has provided the basis on which to go forward. The report must also provide a watershed moment for the way in which our society and our politics discuss this issue. There are children and young people in this country and adults, including trans children and young people and adults, who are desperately worried and frightened by the toxicity of this debate. There are healthcare professionals who are scared to do their job and make their views known. And Dr. Cass has said, and I quote, "Toxic, ideological and polarised public debate has made the work of the review significantly harder," and she says it will hamper the research that is essential to finding a way forward. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I say that even in this, a general election year, there is surely one issue on which we can down tools and work together, and that is in pursuit of the healthcare of vulnerable people. And can I also pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove? We have many scraps across the dispatch box, but for his role in commissioning this review, he deserves our thanks and respect. And I hope that I can work constructively with the Health Secretary to put children's health and well-being above the political fray.
Chief State. I welcome all of those who have changed their minds about this critical issue. Because in order to move forward and get on with the vital work that Dr. Cass recommends, we need more people to face up to the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that makes them feel. And so I say to the honourable gentleman opposite me, I hope he has the humility to understand that the ideology he and his colleagues espoused was part of the problem. He talks about the culture and the toxicity of the debate. Does he understand the hurt that he caused to people when he told them to just get over it? Does he know that when he and his friends on the left spent the last decade crying culture wars where legitimate concerns were raised, an atmosphere of intimidation was created and had the impact on the workforce that he has rightly described? They were scared or worried to go into it. And does he now have the good grace to apologise to those who have been maligned in public life, including his own female colleagues, and for the chilling effect that this has had on clinicians, journalists and campaigners who are trying to raise the alarm? I say this because I want to believe the honourable gentleman when he says he has turned a corner on this. We now have to start with a new page for the sake not just of the children and young people that we are looking after, but also for the sakes of their families, many of whom will be watching this, living with the consequences of this ideology and this secrecy, wondering how on earth the honourable gentleman is talking about general elections, when for them, every single day, every single minute that their children have to live with the treatment they have dealt with, it will never, ever be reversed.
Dame Jackie Doyle-Price.
That was fantastic. Madam Deputy Speaker, this report is clearly very welcome, but has frankly been a long time coming. But one of the issues I'd really like to put to my right honourable friend is really the whole failure of governance that this shows. NHS England's specialist commissioning in particular require challenge here, because what was initially commissioned, as she's explained, as a treatment course for a small minority of people has been allowed to expand unchecked and without any consideration of the ethics of what was being done to children. So can she tell me what she's going to do to make sure that doesn't happen again? And secondly, the Tavistock clearly enjoyed the popularity that it was brought to that institution by being at the front end of what was seen as a cutting-edge set of treatments. Frankly, the Governor's allowed that to get in the way of what they should have been doing, which was patient safety. So could she also tell me what she prepares to do about that too?
May I thank my honourable friend who, in her parliamentary career, has done so much to shine a light on this sort of behaviour, but also the worries that she has espoused, both publicly and privately, about the children, the young people at the heart of this. So, in terms of what we are looking to the future, the Tavistock Clinic has shut. It stopped, as I say, admitting patients a year ago. These new services that are already in place, the 2 new hubs, but of course the plans to expand further across the country, is about ensuring that we have a multidisciplinary approach to these young people, so that exactly the experiences that Dr. Cass sets out so starkly in her report, all of those conditions are treated so that children are treated as human beings, as patients, not as siloed conditions. One of the main problems that emerged with the Tavistock behaviour, the way that it took place, is that gender ideology was, or gender questioning was siloed in a way that no other health or mental health condition was. And we want to move back to a place where clinicians are no longer scared of looking after children and young people with these issues, that they see it as part of their general practice, their general work. That is how we are best going to address the very complex needs of many of these children and young people.
SNP spokesperson Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful for advance sight of the statement. Madam Deputy Speaker, nobody's identity should be up for debate, nor should it be used as a political football. Indeed, Dr. Cass said in her report, polarisation and stifling of debate do nothing to help the young people caught in the middle of a stormy social discourse, and in the long run will also hamper the research that is essential to finding the best way of supporting them to thrive. And that polarisation is the last thing needed by young people in accessing care, their families and the NHS staff working hard to care for them. I wonder if the Secretary of State agrees that we must all remain respectful at all times when discussing these important issues, and that decisions on this and any other type of treatment should rightly be made by clinicians and not by politicians. Dr. Cass explicitly makes the point that her report is not about questioning trans identities or rolling back access to healthcare for trans young people. Indeed, supporting and improving the gender identity healthcare system for all, including children and young people, is what we should be focused on. So I wonder if she can confirm today whether any additional funding will be made available to ensure that young trans people can access the quality healthcare that they need and deserve. And finally, on conversion practices, the Government Equalities Office said last month in an answer to a written question that the Government expects to deliver a draft bill that takes account of the independent cash review. So can she provide an update on what conversations she's had with Cabinet colleagues on how the cash review will influence the UK Government's legislative proposals on banning conversion practices, and when these are expected to be published?
Secretary of State.
So, may I urge both the Scottish National Party in Scotland and indeed Labour in Wales, because of course health is devolved in those countries, may I encourage them to respond as quickly as possible to the findings of this review. She asks me whether it's barnetised. For these purposes, our work to ensure that these clinics meet the needs of our population in England is not additional money, but we are reprioritising within NHS budgets to ensure that these services are spread across the country. I would encourage the Scottish nationalists to prioritise the needs of their children and young people in the same way. I would also gently make the point that when it comes to the atmosphere of this debate, I do not believe it has been helped by the SNP's highly controversial Hate Crime and Public Order Act. And I note, for example, the Twitter behaviour and engagement on Twitter of very, very high-profile people within Scotland and the impact that that has had, where people have dared to name activists in this arena. I would also ask the Labour Party and Scottish Labour Party to explain to us why it is that they helped the SNP pass that act, because to me this is all about the atmosphere.
Chair of the Equalities Committee, Caroline Notes.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Dr Cass's observations around violent and degrading pornography are chilling, and we know the impact that is having not just on young girls, but actually on all our young people. But her recommendations specifically include significant references to expanded services and follow-through services for 17 to 25-year-olds. Can I ask my right honourable friend what concern she has regarding the capacity for that, and what impact that might have for other areas of healthcare? We know that the transition from children's services to adult services can be problematic in a wide range of services, not least for those suffering from body dysmorphia, those suffering from eating disorders. So can my right honourable friend explain whether there might be any crossover where we could see young people then accessing some sort of interim service before the age of 25? And is there going to be more funding committed so that we can see those services, and so that we don't, as all of us will face in our constituencies, see the horror of young people not able to access CAMS services before they turn 18 and then become reliant on adult mental health care?
Well, may I thank my right honourable friend, and she is absolutely right to identify the cohort of young people between the ages of 17 and 25 as being of particular concern now that we have a clear path in relation to the treatment of children and young people under the age of 17. I have now asked NHSE to focus primarily on that next cohort, because again, speaking to parents, one can only get a very real sense of the concerns they have as to the word cliff edge has been used by them, as to the cliff edge between children, young person services and adult services for this very, very vulnerable group of young people. I do not want that to be the case, and so we will see over the coming months work developed by NHSE to help this cohort. But I think she has a sense of just how transformational not just this report with its evidence is, but also the challenges that means that for our health service in England and how we choose to respond to it. In terms of funding, NHS England has committed more than £17 million to the 2 new hubs in this financial year. I hope and expect that our devolved administrations will commit similar sums of money to look after the children and young people in their areas.
Dame Nia Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, she speaks there of the need to have multi-site centres and the fact that 2 hubs have already been put in place. Could you tell us a little bit more about what plans she has to expand to make it multi-site and when that's likely to happen?
Very much so. We have started, as I say, with the 2 sites. We hope to expand to Bristol later this year, and there will be a further 3 or 4 sites across the country of England. However, and this is a really important part of the report, this isn't just about specialist services. This is about giving clinicians the confidence to practice with, to look after children and young people who may well be presenting at their clinics or their surgeries with this as one of a number of conditions, and we want to give them back that confidence and that comfort that they do not have to just go down this narrow pathway of specialist services. Of course, that will be appropriate for many, but we want to treat the whole of the child, not just this particular condition in the way that has happened in the past.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and first I must declare my interest as a practising NHS consultant paediatrician whose practice sometimes involves caring for children with the conditions we've been describing this afternoon. The report is very sobering reading of an example of where ideology has been allowed to trump evidence and safeguarding. And I want to bring the Secretary of State to one particular example, which is where individuals have thwarted attempts of the Cass report to do research into understanding better the outcomes for some children. I'm really pleased to hear they're now cooperating. But we do have a situation where if you look at the letter at the end of the CAS report appended to it from John Stewart, the National Specialised Commissioning Director, he says that the NHS England wrote to all NHS trusts, chief executive and medical directors, and that yet still this data was not released. The duties of a doctor, as per the GMC, state that doctors should engage with colleagues to maintain and improve quality and safety of care. So, I ask the Secretary of State, who exactly blocked this data research? What investigation is going to be done to find out who was individually responsible, and how will they individually be held accountable for their actions? How was it possible in the first place for them to do so, and what is she doing to ensure that data cannot be blocked in this way in the future?
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend who brings her clinical expertise and experience into this chamber in this very, very important debate. In terms of the precise questions of who did what when, I hope she'll understand it. I've been working at pace over the last few days with this report. I have asked these questions and I will update the House when I'm in a position to do so. But I would draw the House's attention back to the expectation, not just the moral expectation, but the professional expectation for the medical profession now, in light of this review and the evidence it has produced, is that clinicians and medical professionals will act in accordance with these recommendations, which will mean that when regulators look at the conduct of medical professionals, they are doing so against this backdrop and against these expectations, so that if there are people who are operating under the misguided apprehension that their ideology trumps this evidence, then I wholly and fully expect the regulators to crack down on that.
I am very anxious to make sure that everybody can get in, because I know it's an important statement, but we do need to make sure that the questions are brief, so the Secretary of State is able to be brief in response. We do have a big debate on the Rwanda bill, followed by another debate on the hospice movement, and I'm sure that many of those colleagues will be wanting to participate in those as well. So perhaps if we can just bear that in mind in thinking of the questions. Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for her thoughtful and considered statement on the CAS review, especially in mentioning the journalists such as my friend Hannah Barnes, who blew the whistle on the Tavistock Clinic. As she says, those who've raised this issue over the last few years, desperately concerned about the safeguarding of vulnerable children and young people, too young to make life-changing decisions, are owed a heartfelt apology for being no-platformed, ghosted, sidelined and disciplined at the behest of a few extreme groups of activists, some within political parties. Does she agree that academics, politicians, writers, psychologists, actors and anyone questioning their workplaces signing up to Stonewall law have now been vindicated by Dr. Cass's expert review? And does she agree that they should be apologised to?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I come to the dispatch box with huge admiration for the Honourable Lady, for the commitment she and others on the Labour backbenchers have shown, even though they were doing so in a culture and an atmosphere where their views were demeaned, they were sneered at, they were castigated for so doing. Indeed, I hear rumours that there were efforts made to remove certain members from the party itself. This is why, this is the moment now for apologies, for humility, but also for us to start with a clean page and ensure that when perfectly reasonable questions are asked about the medical treatment of our children, those questions are allowed to be asked in an atmosphere of respect and understanding, so that these very, very vulnerable children and young people are looked after in a caring and careful way.
Miriam Cates.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I warmly welcome the Cass Review and its findings and an extraordinarily strong statement from my right honourable friend. I've no doubt that what happened at GIDS will go down as one of the worst safeguarding and medical scandals of our generation. But I want to pay tribute to the very brave parents, including those in the Bayswater support group, who have been raising concerns about this for years, raising concerns about the ethics and the safety of putting vulnerable children on irreversible and unevidenced medical pathways to achieve something that can never be achieved, which is to change their sex. But those who spoke up for the interests of children, and frankly for the interests of common sense, were labelled bigots, transphobes and even fascists. And even after those concerns were raised and Dr Cass was commissioned, the Tavistock was allowed to continue to practice, which was a shocking suspension of the precautionary principle. This scandal happened because too many adults put their own desire for social approval above the safety of vulnerable children. How can we make sure that that does not happen again?
Well, as my honourable friend was asking that question, there were people on the benches opposite tutting her. And that shows that whilst some understand the need to keep this debate about the clinical and compassionate needs of these children, there are still people on the benches opposite who don't get it. And the idea that the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, for example, would sign a charter in 2020 describing bodies like the Women's Place UK, which campaigns, dare I say it, for single-sex rape refugees, something that the House knows I have an enormous commitment to, that apparently is trans-exclusionist hate groups. That sort of language is the language that needs to be apologised for so that we can all move on, because we are expecting clinicians, we are expecting medical professionals to do the right thing by this report and by our children and young people. There needs to be some leadership from all of us in public life to ensure that we are setting the right examples to those people.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. At its heart, the Cass report, sadly, highlights the lack of care or the low standard of care for our young people. That they were caught up in a toxic debate, there were long waiting lists, and indeed that debate seeped into the staffing of the medical profession. So would the Secretary of State agree with me now that we have to look at the well-being of our children, look at it holistically, and could she tell us how she's going to overcome the recruitment problems and the staffing problems that have been created by this toxic debate?
May I thank the Honourable Lady, if I may say so, someone else, actually, who has an exemplary record of campaigning on this. This comes down to the very, very careful review that Dr Cass has herself written. We have to get away from this idea that if a child presents with gender distress, that is the only part of their health that we care about, that we look into. Of course not. We have to look across the board to ensure that we are looking after every single part of them, and also not assuming that medical pathways are the only and inevitable pathway for them. I think one of the problems and one of the concerns that have been raised about the terrible, terrible mental health that many children and young people suffer in this report is that wasn't being looked after. They were just put on these drugs and expected to get on with it, if you like. And that is wrong, and we are determined to change that.
Paul Bristow.
Deputy Speaker, what was the Secretary of State's reaction to the news that almost all gender clinics refused to cooperate with the Cass review? And does she agree that this is a too important issue for a circle the wagons attitude? What can she do to ensure that government guidance is followed to the letter and in spirit when we tackle a gender ideology that seems to be running rampant through our public institutions?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not about my emotions, but I can tell the honourable gentleman I was disgusted and I was angry. And what is more, to me, this is about our public space. our public space being able to have these conversations, and if, for example, a part of our public institutions, whether it's NHS, schools or whatever, are asked to respond to a very, very thoughtful and careful review such as this, then of course they must do so, because this information doesn't belong to them, it belongs to their patients, it belongs to future patients, because we want to shape the services to help them, and it belongs to us as a nation. And so for me, the welcome about turn that they were now going to provide this data happened. I'm pleased it's happened, but my goodness me, I wish they'd done it earlier.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. All trans children and young people deserve access to high-quality, timely healthcare and support. There are around 100 studies that have not been included in this CAS report, and we need to know why. The Minister obviously is not concerned about the way the CAS report has been used to perpetuate a broader hostile environment towards trans people in the UK, created in part by the government's delay to the GRA. Misrepresenting the report and this high and mighty attitude from the Minister helps no one. Will the Minister commit to extra funding needed to help young people have a holistic approach to their healthcare pathway?
So I'm not quite clear whether the Honourable Lady supports this report or is castigating it. I have no idea whether she supports it or not. What is interesting, however, is that we are trying, with this review, a very thorough review, a very thoughtful review, those are the words of her front bench spokesman, that with this review we are trying to use this evidence to help clinicians treat our young people and children in a compassionate, caring way. That I've noticed, and I've had it reported to me by others who have been watching this, that there are certain campaigners are trying to build up a head of steam that this report is somehow flawed. It is not. This is superb evidence, and we are asking, and the NHS has assured us they're going to be acting on it.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The CAS review highlights the deterioration in mental health in young people. It particularly highlights the impact of social media, putting awful pressures on young people. The mental health crisis is obviously in both boys and girls, but particularly, as she highlighted earlier, in girls and young women. Will the Secretary of State continue to turbocharge and give CAMS crisis teams the resources they desperately need to support our young people?
May I thank my friend for his question. We want to help not just with crisis support, but to help prevent our young people from getting into the position of crisis in the first place. And so we are rolling out mental health support teams ahead of our schedule, actually, across schools. That's a really important piece of work that will be helping already, we think, 44% of the student population. We want to, of course, go even further. And we have increased the number of children and young people aged under 18 through NHS-funded mental health services from the 12-month period ending the March 2021 to some 758,000 children. Of course, we want that support to be there, both in the community, but also importantly to help clinicians understand that this is just one of several sets of conditions that they should have confidence to work on to look after the child holistically.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, given the vile campaigns which are directed towards anyone who disagrees with the transgender lobby, I think that we should congratulate Dr. Cass and her team for having the courage to make the report which they have made, and also I've got to say to the Minister today for her robust defence of that report as well. Given in light of the report, and given the fact that it seems that the transgender lobby has infiltrated the NHS in England, what steps is she taking to purge that lobby from the NHS? And also, what discussions has she had with ministers in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales to ensure that the same policies and practices are not carried out in the public and private sectors there?
I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the reason I'm able to be so robust on this is because I believe it. I believe it. And so this, which may be different from others, the challenge that he rightly puts, though, to NHS England is that we have to ensure that it is acting as an organisation, but also at an individual and local level, to implement the evidence and the reforms that this report recommends. I want to be fair to clinicians, medical professionals, managers and others who very much support this review, and so I want to help support them bring about the recommendations, and issues as to what individual clinicians may or may not have done in the past will be a matter for both NHS England but also regulators going forward. The moral and the professional expectation is that in future, clinicians, medical professionals, all of us will respect the evidence and the recommendations of this important report.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to put on record my thanks to Dr Hilary Cass for her thoughtful and comprehensive review. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that those of us across this House who for the last few years have been calling for a pause to wait for Cass because of concerns, not with the L, the G, the B, but the T element of the banning of the conversion therapy, does she believe that we have been completely vindicated in our call?
Yeah. Well, again, may I thank my honourable friend very sincerely for her help in raising these difficult questions and doing so, as she has just demonstrated, in a very thoughtful and careful manner. I know she shares my concern that the children and young people at the heart of this should be our focus, and that we need to build the system around them rather than them being slotted in to the system as has happened in the past. In terms of conversion therapy, and again I'm being very, very mindful of the sensitivities of this, we are committed to supporting all victims of conversion practices, but we do want to avoid any unintended consequences and ensure that the draft bill takes account of the independent Cass review. And so that is why my Cabinet counterpart, Minister for Women and Equalities, is leading the work in this area and very much considering this very complex issue as part of our approach to this sensitive and important matter.
Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The starting point of all modern medicine must be robust and reliable evidence, in fact rigorous. Back in 2017, I put in a written question because, at the request of my trans constituent, they were concerned that many adults and young people were putting themselves through a process and it wasn't the right one for them. That was 2017, Secretary of State. And we still haven't had much better data. And the data is the most important thing that we know, that informs everything. There has been a chilling effect in this chamber. There has been a chilling effect on social media for people that have spoken out, that have asked questions like that. Questions you ask for everyday healthcare, and we have denied that, and the government has denied that for the children in our care. So please, Secretary of State, the member for Ilford North has been fantastic. He has shown great maturity and reflection on his comments in the chamber and in the media. So has the Secretary of State. But please, from one that has been at the other end of this, to the Secretary of State, let's absolutely get the tone right of this debate, and let's absolutely move forward. The Cass report is a great thing. We have to work with it to deliver the best outcomes for the children in our care.
Well, again, I approach the dispatch box with humility because I know the journey and the debates and the questions that she has put forward, not just on behalf of that particular constituent, but on the wider issue of women and the treatment of women within healthcare, but also other parts of public life. I very much want us to view the future as a clean sheet so that we can build the services around the children, as I say, rather than expecting them to slot in to the convenience of some of the arguments that have been put forward in the past. But there is, and I think we have to acknowledge this has been such a long and toxic debate that there will be people who want answers. And I appreciate the fact that the honourable gentleman opposite has walked back some of his comments, but I do think it is important we acknowledge the toxicity so that we can move on and achieve exactly what she and I and others around the chamber, and interestingly, the people opposite are now, they're now chuntering from a sedentary position. Interesting that I think we can make a real change, but a little less sniping from the sidelines, a little more constructive work is what is needed.
Nick Fletcher.
Deputy Speaker, I have called out this ideology locally and here in Westminster with colleagues at every opportunity available to me. At last, it appears the world is waking up to this issue. Sadly, we know of at least 9,000 children who have been affected by this scandal, possibly damaged for life. So firstly, I ask the Minister if she will establish a public inquiry into this issue. Secondly, alongside reforms to the NHS, we must re-establish safeguarding in schools. Will the Minister liaise with the education colleagues to fix our statutory safeguarding guidance, keeping children safe in education? This currently downplays the risk factor around a child identifying as trans. It must be addressed. And finally, I believe there are many bad actors who have paddled this nonsense, clearly knowing what they were doing, while destroying our young people's lives. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe if there is any justice, these individuals should feel the full weight of the law. I hope they are quaking in their boots. They ought to be.
Well, may I thank my honourable friend for his powerful intervention just now and his question. I'm going to deal, if I may, with the point about the public inquiry, because I know there are some who are asking whether that would be appropriate. I hope, will he take it from me that what I'm trying to do at the moment, bearing in mind that the report landed less than a week ago, I am determined to drive forward the actions that are needed on the ground to help children and young people. I think actually we've had a 4-year review into this. You know, Dr. Cass has gathered a great deal of evidence. It is a very, very thorough review. And so for the moment, I want to concentrate on implementing these recommendations and on ensuring that the services are brought up to the standards he rightly understands. And on his second point, of course, I will liaise with my right honourable friend in education. Again, this is about helping all public sector professionals ensure that they are acting on the evidence as set out in the Cass review for the sake of our children and young people.
Joanna Cherry.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I warmly welcome this statement? It's not something she will often hear from me. But as she said, the Cass report has vindicated the concerns of many whistleblowers, including feminists and LGBT activists who warned of the consequences for children of unevidenced medical interventions and the ideological capture of the NHS. Now, for doing so, we, and because I was part of this, we were defamed and hounded by organisations that many of us had formerly supported, like Stonewall, Mermaids, Pink News, who I had to sue for defamation, and the misnamed Equality Network in Scotland. Now, to their shame, members of this House and members of the other place joined in this bullying and groupthink. So while I hear what she has to say about a public inquiry and about her immediate focus being on implementing the recommendations, it does seem to me that we do need a public inquiry into how this institutional capture happened in our public bodies. And as we all know, it's not just the NHS, because we need to make sure that never again do ideologues of any sort or science deniers take hold of our public institutions. So when she's done with implementing the recommendations, or as she's doing that, will she support the movement for a public inquiry into these matters?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm conscious I've just answered that, but can I also put on record my thanks and my respect for everything that the Honourable Lady has done in this field. She has at times had to walk a very, very lonely path, and I find it, Madam Deputy Speaker, extraordinary that parliamentarians elected by our constituents to represent the best interests of our constituents and indeed of our countries would find themselves under that sort of pressure for simply stating biological fact. And so I hope she will be working with me to ensure that the recommendations that are in the Cass review are applied not just in England, but in Scotland, in Wales, and I know in Northern Ireland as well.
Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome this report and also very much welcome the very strong statement by the Secretary of State in response to it. If there is one thing that should be above party politics, that should be above political ideology, that should be above cultural trends or virtue signalling, it should be the welfare of our young people. And this report lays bare that sadly that is exactly what has been happening. But this ideology is not only captured part of our NHS, it is found in many of our public sector institutions. So can I ask the Secretary of State, who has clearly taken a very strong leadership position on this today, if she will ensure that across government that the findings of this report are implemented in education, in local government, in social services, in our police force, to ensure that this can never happen again?
Thank my honourable friend and say to him that I view this, sorry, I'm not using a prop, I apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, but this report sets out the evidence. The evidence was not there before. It has taken 4 long years of very, very hard work to gather it. It is now there, and I hope and expect certainly that the health sector will implement these recommendations, but also actually that we can have a conversation about our wider public space. And I'm very, very pleased to read over the weekend the article by my cabinet colleague, the Minister for Women and Equalities. I do think we have got to depoliticise the public space and ensure that these principles, this evidence, is applied across the board for the health of all of our constituents and our country.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Thank you very much. Look, I welcome any research and this report that moves the debate forward. My reading of Cass is that she says there was a toxic debate on both sides, that there were people particularly nasty and vicious on all sides. I've had posters put out outside my house with rude words on them, etc., etc. It has happened on all sides. That's what Cass says, that it is unhelpful. She says it seems to be little evidence that there is large numbers of regret, but there is little evidence on large numbers of success either. There is poor evidence of effectiveness. There needs to be more evidence on the usefulness of social transition. To me, I read it, that there needs to be an awful lot of more evidence. But what she's clear is that young people shouldn't be denied access to healthcare if they are trans. In fact, they should have more healthcare and more pathways. So will the Minister agree to fund research into this, not just getting the evidence from adult services, but proper research, longitudinal studies that can mean that we are evidence-based? And will the government support an amendment that would be Cass